Hey, beer appreciators. Sawasdee krab. Welcome to Beer Times Story, the platform where beer and brewing knowledge is shared. Okay, for today's session, we're going to have a good burp about from raw barley to malted barley, what changes the topic. So, you're probably familiar with the four main beer brewing ingredients, which are, water, hops, yeast, and malt. Now, to be a bit more specific about the last ingredient, the term malt in beer and brewing regard is understood to be malted barley. Both words are used interchangeably, and to this point, you might think like, so or what then, right? Well, if you really think about it, um, every time that we say malt or malted barley, do we actually understand what we just mentioned? You know, has it ever occurred to you to ask yourself these questions like, what even is malt and what differentiates it from the raw barley? Regardless of your input, I insist that we all should find out the answers together. So let's set it as the quest for today's session. And I'm super delighted to say that our faith, our ride, our journey is in one of the finest hands in the world of barley and malt. So here's a bit of the background of our guest speaker. Um, he received a bachelor degree in fermentation technology from Zhongnan universities in the 1980s. And then he pursued a doctoral degree in biochemistry, malting, and brewing science from Harvard Watt University in the UK. In 1991, he started his career in the malt world as the director of technical services at Perry Malt Limited in Canada, and he spent the next 30 years exploring himself in this world of malt in various roles, from the global technical and innovation director at Cargill Malt in the US to the vice president corporate quality and innovation at RAR Corporation in the US. And in present day, he looks after supply chain quality for Boar Malt in Minnesota, USA. Now, apart from his work in malt company, he also an editorial board of Journal of ASBC and MBAA, which is Master Brewer Association of the America Technical Quarter author. And he also authored over like technical papers, researches about barley and malt, as well as an author of the first ever book from the new ASBC series, Practical Brewing Science, called Malt. So please welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Shang Yin. Hello.
Hello, great. Thank you, Napet, for
Yes.
the great introduction. We have not personally met, but thank you
Yeah.
for the detailed introduction. I'm very pleased we have this opportunity to discuss a topic that's very close to my heart and to the heart of the brewers as well worldwide. Thank
Yes.
you for
Sure.
providing this opportunity.
Yes, Dr. Yin, it is, thanks for joining us. Thanks for your time. First of all, for your busy schedule during the daytime. I mean, almost nighttime there. And it is a pleasure to have you on our platform.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Yeah. So how are you doing? It looks like still like a daytime to you there, but it's not, right?
Yes, this is approaching the summer, and in Minnesota, the daytime is very long. So it's after 8 p.m., but it's very bright out there. So it's a great time to enjoy the outdoors here. And of course, have a beer in hand is also a great thing to do. Yeah.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And would this weather considered to be a good time to grow barley, or you have to wait until spring or winter?
Yeah, this is the seeding season, depending on where you are. If you are in the Midwest in the US, this busy seeding season is probably more or less down. But if you are on the prairies of Canada, you're about starting seeding or in the middle of seeding. So all depending on how the soil condition is. And this year, fortunately, here the moisture in the soil is much more appropriate. So we are
Okay.
hoping to have a much better crop this year from North America. And hopefully we don't have to rely on other continents to supply us good quality barley for malting.
Right. That's hopeful, and it's great to hear that. So can I touch a little bit about your day job at Bor Malt? So you work in the supply chain quality section, right?
Yeah,
What
that's
did
right.
you? I mean, yeah. What do you actually do there? What's your daily role?
I work on the supply chain quality, mainly focusing on the shipment quality to customers. So making sure that the shipment we have is within the customer specifications, and
Okay.
also follow up with the logistics to make sure the good quality malt is delivered to the door of the customers without any issues. And also doing some innovative work as well. And at the same time, I volunteer to support the community work with MBAA and ASBC. So I'm the Asia Liaison Officer for the ASBC. So I work with brewers in Japan, China very closely. And for the upcoming August, we have a WBC World Brewing Conference, and it will be held here in Minneapolis. I'm looking forward to seeing many of them. Hopefully, some of your audience will be able to join as well. I can meet them in person.
That's great. It's just right there at your backyard, right?
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Right. Cool. So Dr. Yin, I mean, before we jump to today's topic, I would like to ask a bit about your background, like the beginning of your career in the world of malt and beer. So say you spend, like 30 years, down this rabbit hole, but at the
Mm.
beginning, what drove you to set foot in this direction in the first place? What is the story behind it?
Yeah, it started when I saw this nice barley growing in the field where my hometown was, and that is in the Shandong province of China. That's on the east coast. Probably you heard a brewery called Qingdao Brewery. That's in
Oh,
Shandong
yeah.
province. And at
Okay.
that time, I had no idea what a beer tastes like or smells like, because at that time there were very few breweries in China. But I was always wondering, what could we do with this nice crop? It looks so good. But when it's actually comparing with wheat, it didn't really produce good food because it's rather coarse. So I was
Right.
wondering what better option there is for utilization of this barley. And then I had the chance to study fermentation technology in Jiangnan University. At that time, it's called Wuxi Institute of Light Industry, where I learned all sorts of applications and uses of cereal grains for value-added products, including things like alcoholic beverages, enzymes, amino acid, organic acid, etc. And then after that, I had the chance to go abroad to study further, and I chose Scotland to learn about brewing and
Right.
also malting for whiskey making. I thought that was interesting. It's mysterious. It was mysterious to me, but it was a great choice, and I was able to learn a lot. And since then, I started to love this subject and started to really set my mind on barley malt and brewing and distilling. And then I started to teach
Mhm.
after my postdoctoral study in China for malting and brewing related courses. And then I had the chance to work at the Prairie. And then the rest of it is what you introduced about me. It's history. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's fascinating from that small spot that just sparked your liking in the malt, and how could you better find a way to utilize it, like what you mentioned. And 30 years later, here you are, right?
Yes, indeed. It's quite a long time, but I felt the journey was short because I really enjoyed it all the
So
way.
more, there's
Yeah.
more for you to explore and
Mhm.
look at.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. That's awesome. And okay, so let's just get to the topic then.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Maybe before you move on, I did do some brewery related work. And at
okay,
that
sure.
time, it was SEB Miller in the UK. I
Mhm.
was the director of brewing raw materials.
Oh yeah,
That's
yeah.
between Cargill malt and raw malting. Yeah.
That's in
That's
UK,
before
right?
ABI acquired SAB Miller.
That is in UK, right?
Yes.
The Miller. Okay.
Yeah, my professors in Edinburgh were saying, see, the world is going on in circles and you're coming back. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, like what I mentioned in the introduction section, what even is malt, and what differentiates it from the raw barley, right? You can see in this photo. I'm going to pull one photo up first, just for a quick view.
Yeah.
And this is the comparison between raw barley from one of the supplier, and on the other hand, the photo on the right, the picture on the right of the screen, is the malted barley from one of the disclosed supplier. And as you can see here, right, with naked eyes, it is quite hard to tell them apart, except from the difference in color in this case, which is by design. So you can see that it has some contrast, right? But however, there is a certain type of malted barley that has a super pale color. And to distinguish it from the raw barley with your own eyes, with the purely observation alone, it is truly challenge. So, Dr. Yan, I think it is the good place to start with this simple question first. What is malt?
Yeah, malt in broader sense is germinated barley that has gone through steeping, germination, and kilning. However, if we just say malt, normally we are referring to barley malt, that is germinated barley. As you know, barley is raw grain. It's very hard by the touch, and it's very hard to chew, and it's very hard to go into solutions. But if you feel the malt, you can see it's very crunchy and it smells aromatic. So we needed to do the malting process to convert barley to malt. Several simple reasons. One is for the yeast later on in the fermentation to eat the sugars, because yeast would not utilize starch in the raw grain. We need to break down the starch into fermentable sugars like maltose, glucose, so that the yeast can eat these small sugars and turn that into alcohol. One is for the yeast. And two is for the human being. When we consume beer, we needed to see the color and needed the aroma. And therefore, by malting the barley, we add the color, we add the aroma. Depending on how strongly you roast or you bake the barley after germination, you will get different colors in the malt and different strengths in the aroma as well. So in general, we are providing the nutrition for the yeast to fermentation and provide the color and aroma, etc., for the beer.
Got it. So basically, malt in this term is kind of the end product. Say, raw barley is subjected to the process to turn them to the malted barley, right?
Correct.
And the process of making malt and malted barley, like what you mentioned, is known as malting. And there is malt house out there at the malt company to do this job for us, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. So you've already briefly touched about the malting process. Can you walk us through, the principle of the malting process in this case? I'm going to pull one photo up and you can just,
Yeah. No, you can think about in the early spring when the seeds are in the ground and there's the spring rain, when the spring is warming up and then the spring rain comes, then the seeds would imbibe water, and then because the alternation of light and darkness, and then the seed would start, the field warmth will start to germinate. So, and then it will become a plant, and then it later on grow to the plant. But in our malt house, we have very good control so that we don't convert all the nutrients in the seed into plant. So we preserve that for the brewers so they can extract the solubles for the wort. That's the like juice for making grapes, so that the yeast can utilize that nutrient and turn that into what we need in the beer. So it's a very similar process in the malting plant, you would steep the barley. So this is your first figure here, steeping. And during that time, you supply sufficient oxygen. You see the oxygen being bubbled in the steeping grain. And therefore, your grain is taking in water, but at the same time, there's sufficient oxygen for it to breathe. And then once the temperature and moisture is to a certain level, the grain like wakes up. It's like the spring wakes up the seeds in the soil. Then it starts to grow the rootlet. And that's what we call that the chit. After steeping, you see the little white rootlet, the roots started to form. And that means the seed is activated and it started to produce enzymes and then release the nutrient from the center of the kernel and then ship them to the tip where the rootlet and germ start to grow. So that's steeping. Normally, steeping will take about 2 days. And during these 2 days, there's on and off water. Sometimes we call it wet steep and dry steep. The dry steep means you drain the water and then you take away the CO2 from the steeping tank. So you are not suffocating the seeds with CO2, too much CO2. So the seeds still breathe. It's like in the spring, if you have continuous rain, the seed will not grow. But if you have showers, the seed will grow quickly. So the seed needs oxygen, needs some air, needs some light and darkness. So there's alternative condition to stimulate its growth. And that is steeping. It takes up to 2 days. So you need to be patient because this is very critical. You don't just let the seed take so much water and then you send to germination. You need to let the water distribute and redistribute in the seeds so the whole seeds is hydrated. In another word, there's no dry spot, no dry pocket in the seeds. Then when you ship to germination, the water will start to hydrolyze the macromolecules like starch and proteins. So at that time, you need to control the temperature to be normally below 20 degrees C. So you don't want to cook the barley because if it's too hot, you may push it too fast. And then that's not going to give you even hydration. So at the end of steeping, normally we would measure how much water did the seeds pick up, and then also what's the rate of chitting, how many kernels by percentage you see the white dot, that's the rootlet start to show. And those are good parameters to monitor the quality of steeping. And then that's steeping. And then the major part of the malting process is the long germination process. This will take about 4 days or 5, depending on the vigor of the barley. And during this time, you control the temperature, but now you don't submerge the kernels in water. You may need to spray it with water if it's getting dry, but during this time, you are controlling the germination. So it's like you have very low soil, and then the ground is wet. You just wait for the seeds to grow. But in this case, the growth is very well controlled. You don't want to grow to very long shoots then because you dry it and you clean that off. It's a loss. It goes to feed. So what's retained in the kernel is what is useful for the brewers. That's what the brewer will get because at the end, you will clean the malt. So during this 4 days, you will watch and see the shoots or the germ start to grow under the husk. You don't see them quite readily in the first couple of days, but you do see the rootlets, like what you're showing here, the white, long, like fibrous rootlets. You see that. And that will reach out and pick up moisture, etc., particularly if it's in moist environment. And then after the germ, or what we call the acrospire, grows to about a kernel length. If you grow it more, we call it overgrown, then it will shoot out. Then it's time to stop. During this 4 days, you will see that the what we call that the modification of the kernel progresses, so that the cell walls that wraps up the content in the cell would start to degrade. So, which is mostly beta glucans, and then the moisture and the enzyme would penetrate in to the cell and attack the protein, and then attack the starch granules.
Right.
And during that time, you will want to have balanced modification. That means you want to have a lot of the cell wall material broken down, so like beta glucans, because if not, then it restricts the enzyme movement. But also later on, if it goes to the wort, it produces very viscous wort. It's very hard to separate from the spent grain. Or later on, if you're doing beer filtration, it's viscous. It will block the filtration membrane. So you want to degrade that, and that's normally a parameter the maltsters would have to target and then hand over to the brewers at a certain point. But also you want to have controlled protein modification. If it's too much, you degrade too much, you supply too much nitrogen, and then your good nitrogen, good peptide for generating foam or mouthfeel will be reduced. So you don't want that. But if you control it too hard and you don't release enough free amino nitrogen, like amino acid, then your yeast would not have enough nutrients, because your yeast need to eat sugar, that's carbohydrate, but also nitrogen as the nutrients as well. It's because the yeast need to grow and multiply and produce daughter cells, and these cells need the protein as well to grow, so you need to supply that. That's why you need this balanced, we call that modification. That's why when you talk to brewers, you will hear the beta glucan, the cell wall modification, but you hear this Kohlbach index. That's the ratio of soluble to total protein. So if you have 10% protein in the barley, and now you have 4% solubilized, you have a 40% Kohlbach index. Or in North America, they call that S/T, soluble to total. And then there are other parameters like enzymes, because you produce enzymes in order for the brewers to leverage that to degrade the starch later on in the brew house. And particularly if a brewer is using starchy adjunct like rice or corn, they will need you in the malt house to produce enzymes like alpha amylase, beta amylase, limit dextrinase, etc., to degrade the starch in the adjunct as well. But if you are using an all malt brewing beer recipe, then it's less critical. But you still want to produce the enzymes, including other enzymes like proteinases and etc. So that's germination quickly. So it takes 4 days, and then at the 4th day or the 5th day, when it's ready, you will feel that the kernel, if you can rub the kernel, you feel there's no hard core. That means it's all modified. And then if you taste this sweet, and then that means this is well modified, and then you can send that to kiln. And here it's your right figure expressing the layout of the barley in the kiln. And that means you switch from a moistened air type of airflow to dry air. And at the beginning, you don't want to apply heat very high right away, because at high moisture, the enzymes are very susceptible to denaturing. Therefore, you want to increase heat gradually. And therefore, as you said here, maybe starting from 45°C or so, and then you're trying to drive away most of the moisture, you need much more air in this case than when it's being germinated. And then it's for you doing a quick evaporation of the moisture. First, a free moisture, then the bound moisture. And then you raise the temperature so the grain bed will rise with the temperature as well. And then that's when you produce malt color, aroma, some caramel reaction will take place. and the melanoidin reaction would take place because of the free amino nitrogen and reducing sugars, and the heat will produce the melanoidin and the color components. So it's a browning reaction. And that's when you start to smell very aromatic malty note, like a good French bakery also. And it's very, very nice. So that process for kilning could take 24 hours, or in some cases, if they use multiple deck, could be more like 2 days.
Right.
And at the end of that kilning process, you have about only 4 to 5% moisture in the malt. But during germination, it's like 40 to 45% moisture. So it uses a lot of energy to do the kilning.
Yeah. So basically, this is the principle of malting process. But actually, there are more. There is the pre-activities for malting. Like the collecting the raw barley, cleaning, sorting, and all the stuff, right? And also the post production of how you store it and make sure the moisture is homogenized and all of that, cleaning all the shoot. Yeah, but well, I mean, if I get this right, it is very fascinating to actually see this process, because to me, I think the malting process is a kind of the act of human, that we actually trick the barley to think that they are in the soil, in the good environment with water, with oxygen to respire, and we let them grow, right?
Yes.
And after it's when they start growing, they are making new plants, and that's probably their purpose, because they want to prolong their species. Just making the new baby and keep on going with their kind. But then during their happy moment, we just like, okay, you grow enough, we interrupt it, and we kind of stop the growing phase of the new plant, because we want to preserve things that we are interested in the kernel for the future use in the brew house, or in the, I don't know, the distillery. Yeah, maybe. And all of these activities happen inside the malt house. Dr. Yin, can you just give us a quick view of how big the malt house is?
Yeah, malt house can vary in scale. For some craft maltsters, maybe each batch could be a few metric tons to 10, 20 metric tons, particularly if people are using flow germination instead of germination in a vessel, pneumatic vessel. So those are small batches, craft processing. However, in large industrial scale, it could be a few hundred metric tons for each batch. And therefore, you really can produce very homogeneous malt with one batch of malt. But that means you need to have good supply and uniform raw barley to go into the large malt houses, so that the barley they take is homogeneous, so that malt they produce is more homogeneous. So the scale varies.
Right.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, so we now know what malt is, and we understand the principle, the concept of how it is made. But the important question that we haven't touched is, I mean, we've already touched a little bit, scratched the surface, is why we bother malting in beer brewing at all. And I think that the best place to start here is to first understand what is inside the barley kernel. Dr. Yin, please talk about the structure of the barley kernel and the main components that we should know about.
Yes, definitely. I think this graph shows it very clearly. You have demonstrated on the up left corner here the embryo and the endosperm and the husk. The embryo is where the live tissues are. That means when the kernel is ready to grow, you will see rootlets growing out from here, and you will see the exospire, that is the germ, start to grow there. And then the endosperm is where the nutrients is being stored. Of course, body accumulated these nutrients, not for us to originally to make mold from it, but to store its own nutrients so it can slowly release it to the embryo to let the rootlet grow and let the germ grow until the rootlets are long enough to take nutrients from the soil. So it's more like the initial kicking off reservoir for the life of a kernel. But in our case, as you mentioned, Pat, we stop it before it's all exhausting all this package of nutrients in the endosperm. And then if you look at the larger graph here, in the endosperm, there are multiple number of cells. And within each cell, as you can see that round circle that amplify the cells, there's the starch granule, and some of them are small and some of them are large. And then between the starch granules, there's the protein wrapping them up. And then outside, that's the square ones, is the cell wall. So it's a very well-packed structure. So if we wanted to have the enzymes to have access to the starch granules, we would need to break the cell walls surrounding them, and then also attack the protein matrix so that the enzymes can have direct contact with the starch granules. And that's why we say we need the beta-glucan degradation capability. So we need this beta-glucanase to work on the cell wall, and then we need the proteinase to work on the proteins. And it's not all done quick. It progresses very slowly from the dorsal end to the distal end. The dorsal end is where the embryo is, because that's where the enzymes would be very rich. And then normally it progresses the day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. Then the whole kernel is being modified enzymatically. So this is basically the layout and the sequence of modification. And all this processes takes 2 days of steeping roughly to hydrate the kernel, and then 4 to 5 days of germination to degrade and hydrolyze some of these components in the endosperm.
Got it, Dr. Yang. Just quick question here. Like you mentioned the dorsal end and basal end, right? Yeah. Which end is attached to the actual body plant?
Yeah, it is the dorsal end. That's where the embryo is. Okay. Sitting on the crop there. Yeah. The distal end is where the on is. Yeah.
Got it. I mean, actually, there are more components, within this body kernel, but these three are the main one that we should now know. Yeah. So, in summary, like the embryo is where the new plant's gonna grow, right? Rootlets, ascophyte, which is gonna become the body tree plant, and you have the husk like that acts as a natural shield, protecting the embryo and the endosperm from whatever is the outside environment.
The husk it's very important. Normally we say there should not be a lot of breakage or loss of husks because the husk is protecting the embryo, but also later on it helps with the airflow, because if the kernels are packed too tight, and then your airflow would not be very good during germination, particularly during kilning. Also later on, in the brewing process, the brewers would rely on big pieces of husks to help building the filtration bed, so they can do more easily lautering. Yeah. Otherwise, people, like if they're using too much wheat or rice, also they may use rice hulls instead. That's the same purpose. But if you have intact husks from the body, and that's naturally there, that's good.
Got it. And the endosperm is like what you said, it's kind of food reserve or preserve for the embryo to grow. So we can think it as our body fat in some extent.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
All right. Okay, cool. I think, well, our listener should have the brief understanding of how it looks like inside the body kernel. And I think one of the important concept is the zoom in view of endosperm, right? How it is being structured in nature, and how we gonna interfere the process. And later on, down this journey, we're gonna touch of how the malting process, the steeping and germination actually transform things that we want. So the next question is, we now know that the malting process triggered the growth of new plant, and the maltster stop the growth to preserve stuff for later use, like what we've discussed probably like 2-3 times now. But what actually happened inside the barley kernel during malting process, and what stuff that we care so much are to be preserved? So to answer this question, let's zoom in a bit further inside barley kernel and allow Dr. Yin to explain to us the main focus activities that occur. Dr. Yin, what are we trying to achieve here?
Yeah. So this is a very good set of graphs to illustrate the progression of the modification process in general terms, but more specifically, the degradation of cell walls, proteins, and then how we expose the starch for later on degradation in the brew house. So here, I think you saw the content in the round circle is where we talked about. The square are the cell walls, and then the round one is the starch granules. And then in the middle, you see this blue out layer. That is the cell wall in this case. And the cell wall, it's really complicated. But there are two major ingredients in the cell wall. That is beta glucans and pantothens.
Right.
And then pantothens, it's actually more like a ribanoxylane. So it's a long chain 5-carbon sugar polymer. So you have the xylane attaching to it, therefore, and ribose. So it's branched, and therefore you will need different enzymes to degrade that. But normally we don't measure that, and it could produce very good viscosity as well. So a good example is if you're using a wheat malt, you will see the beta glucan level is very low. However, if you measure the viscosity, it's very high. Why? Because wheat is bred for making bread, and we need the pantothens in the wheat to absorb a lot of moisture, to make very nice and soft bread. And normally we don't breed wheat for malting. Therefore, we use the wheat for bread making to make beer malt, and therefore you see a lot of viscosity there because a lot of high amount of pantothens in there, or ribanoxylanes. So so the cell wall is more complicated, but it needed this special set of enzymes. Sometimes we call that hemicellulases to degrade that. And beta glucan is just one measurement, and beta glucanase is one of the enzymes attacking it. So here you have 5 grid here. On the right, you have 0 to 2 days, all the way to 5 days plus. So so on the first day, initially, you are merely generating the enzymes. So if you see the picture, the kernel structure is very tight, very dense, and if you touch it, it's very hard. And then on the second day or third day, you can see that the wrapping material of the cell started to break. That means the cell wall is being degraded to partially, and then enzymes can go through the cell wall, and then that's right, and and then start to attack the protein matrix. And at this stage, you can see the starch granules started to expose themselves a little bit. Then on the third day and fourth day, as the graph shows, the protein started to be degraded. And that's when you see soluble proteins going up, because once it's degraded, it will be readily soluble in warm water. And then the progress continue on fourth day and fifth day. You will see on the picture on the right, the starch granules become to show very clearly, and then the matrix surrounding it, that is proteins, started to disappear because a lot of them become solubilized. Right. And then on the fifth day or later, you can see that the starch granule started to pitted. That means the starch granule loses smooth surface. It started to have holes on it. That means alpha amylase started to attack the starch granules. So at this stage, we wanted to arrest the growth, because if you continue doing that, then your starch will be probably consumed and will be turned into CO2 and water. And that will become part of the respiration loss, or we call it germination loss. So you wanted to preserve as much carbohydrate as possible for the brewers later on to release that in the brew house. But you wanted to give them the enzymes. So during this 5 days germination, you produce the enzymes, you degrade the cell wall, you partially degrade the proteins, and then you expose the starch granules. So that means if you are measuring this with a set of malt specifications, you will see the beta glucan level is going down, normally below 200 at this stage of the germination. And you will see the viscosity of the wort goes down, normally around 1.5 or below. And then you will see the protein start to solubilize more, like 40 to 45%. And then you will see the enzymes, the alpha amylase, the total DP diastatic power, some beta amylase, some limited dextranase. Limited dextranase is a debranching enzyme because the starch granules have two types of starches. One is linear molecule, the other is branched. And therefore, you have this debranching enzyme to debranch it so that they can continuously be degraded by alpha and beta amylases. So that's what it is doing during the process. You don't see a lot of action outside the kernel other than the rootlet growth, but in the kernel, they are very busy doing all of this. Yeah.
Right. Because I think this is basically, in scientific term, or probably in the malt house, the vocabularies that you guys are using is for malt. I mean, during the malting process, the sieving and germination is where you're actually focusing on two activities, which is the cytolytic and proteolytic activities, right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, the cytolytic, yes.
It's for the cell walls, proteolytic, and it's for the proteins, of course. I mean, and then amylolysis is more for the starch degradation. Yeah.
Right, and if you look into this zoom-in view, let's say one box or one wrap of endosperm cells, right?
Yeah.
And what you mentioned, we have the cell wall, which is kind of wrap everything around. So if you don't degrade it, and degrade in this term is to make it, chop it into a smaller molecules, or actually try to unwrap it. So then the other enzymes can go in and do their work, which is the term modification means, right? Is to chop the bigger pieces of polymers or to stuff into a smaller piece. And once the cell wall is unwrapped, you still cannot get into the starch granule because there are protein matrix that still hold, the carbohydrates around, right? You have to just chop all of those protein first, make it soluble, get the enzymes that work on proteins in place, and then at the end of it, you will reach to the carbohydrate, the starch that we want. And without malting process, you were probably not going to achieve this goal, right?
Correct, exactly. So at the end of the malting process, after kilning, you will feel the kernel of the malt is very friable, it's very crunchy. And then of course the aroma, etc. And if you taste it, you can sense it's quite sweet because some of the sugar started to release here. But we must mention that the degree of modification could vary depending on the application and the brewer's brewhouse capabilities. So in some cases, they have very elaborate brewing process, mashing process, like decoction mashing or mashing them at a long time. Therefore, you do not have to have a too well modified malt because they were continuously working on it. But in some other cases, the brewers just wanted to get the malt wet quickly and then shuffle it through to lauter town. Yeah, in that case, you need to supply them well modified malt. It also it's related to how much adjunct you're using. If you're using all malt brewing, like a lot of the craft brewers are doing, then you may not need a lot of the enzymes being produced, and therefore you can use a relatively low protein barley. Therefore, you have more starch in the malt. But if you're using a lot of adjunct, rice or corn or sugar syrup, therefore you have carbohydrate from adjunct. Then you need the good free nitrogen and protein from the malt. In this case, you can have slightly higher protein from the malt. That means you can have a relatively high protein barley to start with.
Got it. And the thing that we care so much to preserve is the starch granule to be extract later on, to be the source of food, the main food for the yeast that use in fermentations and make the beer for us.
Correct. Because if they don't go into the solution, don't get extracted, they will go to the spent grain. And that does not give brewers value. So the brewers value comes from whatever is solubilized in their wort, because that's what is going to the beer. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. Okay. Got it. So we come a long way, for this quest, all this simple question, right? And we are about to reach the finish line. Dr. Yin, as a wrap up, can you please talk about the summary, the differences between raw barley and malted barley? I'll pull up one last chart and let's go through it together.
Yes, sure. Yeah, I think you listed here very well. So as far as crunchability, which is normally, I think, measured through the instrument, like friability, that if you rub it, you will feel barley is as hard as stone, but malt is very crunchy, and that is very true. And moisture content, yes, in the barley is normally over 10%. And if it's too high, like higher than 15%, you may have difficulties maintaining its viability in storage. So you don't want it to be too high. But in the malt, it's 5%. But if you're producing a brewer's malt, a distiller's malt, you could allow higher moisture or malt for food use. But normally you lose 10% moisture. That's part of the malting loss. So from 100 metric tons of barley, you don't produce 100 metric tons of malt. And then the starch content, you're right. So in the process, you could convert some of the starch to sugars, but the total carbohydrate will not increase. If anything, it will decrease. Some of them will be leached out to steeping water. Some of them will turn into CO2 and heat. So you have a little bit of reduction in the raw starch, a little bit increase in sugar. And then what fermentability, of course, even if you extract the barley, it's not going to be fermentable because the starch is not ready for the yeast to utilize. You needed enzymes to break it down. But malt should be good. Protein modification, we mentioned, very little soluble in raw barley. but yeah, there's up to 50% soluble in the malt. And then cell wall modification in raw barley is whole cell wall, no solubility, but we want to have high solubilization of the cell wall, so you don't have a lot of viscosity and you don't have a lot of beta glucans left. Enzyme levels, it depends, but you're right. In barley, there's no alpha amylase unless it's pre-germinated in the field that we don't want. But in the malt, we need some alpha amylase, particularly for adjunct brewing, or for distillers, they rely on this to degrade their other cereal grains in the distilling recipe. And flavor, of course, you wanted the maltiness, you wanted caramel note, you wanted this toffee note in the malt rather than the raw grain dusty note, right? And then the wort clarity, of course, you cannot really get a barley to produce a clear wort easily, but in a malt, you do. Unless you are producing nowadays hazy, juicy IPA, if it's not very clear, that there may not be a problem, but that's special case. And even there, the haze is not necessarily from the barley malt, it's more from other adjuncts like oats also or wheat. So yeah, no, this is a good summary of the differences between raw barley and malted barley. And in general, by the look, they may not look very different, but if you can touch them right away, you'll be able to tell very easily. And if you smell them, even just close your eyes, you can tell the difference. And then, of course, the weight is very different because malt has such low moisture there. Yeah.
Got it. And there are a few things, I mean, here that I want to further discuss. Like first is the crushability, right? For the malted barley, that it has, easy to mill property and friable through malting process. Is that because the cell wall structure of the endosperm is degraded, right? So the thing that hold the barley kind of deform and it's become more friable.
Yes.
Right? Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Because some of the proteins between the starch granules is degraded. Therefore, it's no longer solid structure. So it collapses. Therefore, you have more space between the starch granules. Therefore, it's more friable. Yeah.
Yeah. Got it. And for the enzymatic level, we talked about alpha amylase that in raw barley it's absent, and in the malted one is present. And that is not because the maltster actually add the enzyme to the process, but it's actually from the nature of the barley itself during the germination, right? That it release this or create this alpha amylase.
Correct. That's right. So that's why in the raw barley it's relatively dormant and stable. But once it sees water, and then it will take some process to activate the alpha amylase. Then it will gradually release the starch.
Got it. So, the overall, I mean, the overview theme or the idea of this session is to share the concept of what actually is malt and how it's made and what's differentiated from the raw barley. Dr. Yin, do you have any final thoughts about this topic?
Well, I just think that we call that the malt, the soul of beer. I think it's very important we realize to make a good beer, regardless what type, we need to have good malt. And without good malt, you can add different things, but that wouldn't be true beer. You can add color, you can add aroma from other sources, but the best is still from malt itself. And of course, to make good malt, we not only need good barley, but we also need the maltster's touch. So you cannot rush the process, and you cannot really artificially produce good malt. Therefore, this is more a natural process. This is really good art as well as science. and you need a lot of passion from the maltsters to produce good malt. So I think I'm so happy we have this chance to discuss about malt. Otherwise, to some people, well, malt is malt. It doesn't matter from where. I just buy a cheap malt. But then you may be sacrificing on some quality note or some characteristics or good features from that. So I think it's important one looks at the malt specification carefully and then discuss with the maltsters what is the best malt that can be produced for your type of product and for your style. That's one thing. The other thing is we also need to know in the wine world, every year the grapes are different. We mark the wine bottle crop
Right.
2000 crop, Chardonnay or Cabernet, whatever.
Terroir and all that.
Yeah, we don't mark our beer, okay, 2020 barley crop also. And we wanted every beer every year taste the same once it's established on the market. But I think as a brewer, we should realize barley is an agricultural product. It can change from one year to another. For example, the protein content could be 11% this year, next year could be 13%. That means the brewer will get 20% more nitrogen in the wort. And that's a different wort composition than the year before. So we all need to work together so that, the maltster may need to control the protein solubilization, but the brewers may need to do that the same. Another simple example is the plumpness of the kernel. Each year could be different. So if one year is very plump and the other year is very thin, the brewer need to adjust the mill setting so that you are properly crunching the kernel, you're releasing the content. But if you say, I can't touch the mill, but if it's quite thin, you will have whole kernels going through your mill. You don't get the extract from it. So we need to work together. It's not an isolation for malt production. It's not isolation for beer production. We all work for the same thing, that is final perfect beer. So I'm glad we have this chance to discuss about it.
Yeah, cool. And that is very important aspect is thinking about, brewing process. Normally, people are going to focus on yeast, on hops, right? The new exciting things. And they probably, leave water behind, and malt is like maybe to some extent, like whatever malt is available, but it's the soul of beer, right? It's the one that provide yeast, the nutrients. It's the one that provide all this beautiful aroma and flavor as well. And I think I'm not going to say it deserves more care and more attention, and to understand, what it is, how it's made. It is a very good place to pave a great fundamental for your brewing path, I think. And what you mentioned is so much. It contains a lot of meaning.
Yeah, so that's why what this session is about. I really appreciate it very much, Pat.
Yeah, thank you. And Dr. Ian, just the last one, quick one, before we close the session about malt, right? We say that in brewing world, normally malt refers to or understood to be malted barley, but actually we can have a various product of malt from many type of cereal grains, right? Like rice, wheat, oat. It's just a matter of putting them in the malting process, correct?
Yes, correct. A lot of it is very depending on what you have locally. Like in some countries of Africa, they have sorghum and they malt sorghum. Right. And in some areas, they malt oats, they malt rye. And in some areas, even nowadays in the US, researchers started to come up with rice malt for gluten-free products, etc. So all cereals that germinate can make malt. I even saw corn malt. Maize malt. Some people said if you malt corn, and then the whiskey makers don't need so much exogenous enzymes. You can use that enzyme. But we must realize that different malt from different cereals would differ very much. Like rice, you need to malt at very high temperature, and at the end, the enzyme level is still not as high. So there was a reason our ancestors ended up malting barley, because that's really giving us a very balanced malt package as well as aroma and nutrients. But it's not undoable. We can look at what we have around us and be innovative, and people can really enjoy your product if it's locally made from local grains. So I think the sky is open there. Yeah.
Great. That's awesome. And this is where we will end the session. Dr. Yin, I'm so glad. And thank you so much for your time, coming to visit our platform and become the guest speaker. We truly appreciate it. Yeah. And I just want to say that I'm a huge fan of your malt book. It's an eye-opening, one of the eye-opening book. I would recommend anyone that's really into it just to, have a look into it. Yeah.
Thank you, Pat. And if anyone or yourself have any critiques for the book or wanted to discuss anything in further details, I'm here, happy to do it. I also thank you for this session. I really enjoyed it very much, Pat.
Yeah, appreciate it. And one of my dreams is to visit a malt house, and probably one day I will do it, maybe at Bohr, maybe somewhere else. But yeah, we'll try to make it happen.
You'll be welcome, and anybody who is turning malt to beer is welcome to visit the malt house. Yeah.
Okay, appreciate it. And okay, then I wish you have a great, wonderful evening. And in the meantime, take care.
Yeah. Okay. You too.
Okay. There you have it. Hopefully, you all have, you find a spot or a moment to have a good burp about for today's session. Now we kind of know what actually happened inside the malt house, what's the meaning of malt and malting is. But what we discussed in this hour session is just the tip of the iceberg of the world of malt. And, there are many more to talk about, such as, the actual malting process in detail from start to finish, and the making of various type of malt, what's the process behind it. Because if you look at the malt as a brewing ingredient, you often hear base malt, and then high temperature cube malt, roasted malt, and all kind of the stuff. And the method of making or producing those type of malt is another, art form. And to understand it is will kind of give you an idea of how it would translate to the brewing process as well. And or like what Dr. Yin mentioned about the malt quality stuff, the certification of analysis, what are those names and all this stuff actually means. And it is the malted barley is produced from the barley, which is a crop year, and it varies from year to year. So in order to understand what changes, you better have, a good idea of what is actually being tasted at the malt house. And all the stuff. If your listener out there want to know more in any of this particular topic, just let us know, and we will consider make it happen. Perhaps gonna re-invite Dr. Yin and to the platform and have a great time talking with us again. Okay, so that's it for today's session. The Good Burp session, we will be back in no time. So in the meantime, stay tuned and cheers. Sawasdee krap.